Some mistakes cost you an apology. Morgan's cost him everything. He wasn't supposed to be seen tonight. That was the one rule they gave every janitor, every server, every invisible hand that kept the Harrington Gala running: stay out of the light. And for 3 hours, Morgan had done exactly that. Mopped corners no one looked at. Refilled trays no one thanked him for. Counted the minutes until midnight, when the $180 in his envelope would mean his daughter got her medication and his landlord stopped calling. He had one job. Don't be seen. Then the tray tilted, just half an inch, and a full glass of Chateau Margaux 2009 left his fingers like it had somewhere important to be. Time didn't slow down the way it does in movies. It was instant. Violent. Irreversible. The deep crimson hit Jamie Voss's cream suit like a verdict. The ballroom didn't gasp. It stopped. Music, laughter, the clink of crystal, everything went silent the way a city goes silent right before a storm makes landfall. 300 people in designer clothes turned, and every single pair of eyes landed on the same thing. Morgan. In his standard black service vest. Standing in the wreckage of the worst moment of his life. Jamie Voss didn't shout. Men like Jamie never had to. He looked down at the dark stain spreading across his chest, slowly, methodically, the way a judge reads a sentence before delivering it. Then his eyes lifted, and they found Morgan with the kind of precision that made you understand, instantly, why whole boardrooms fell quiet when this man walked in. Beside him, Vivienne, draped in shimmering gold that cost more than Morgan's entire year, didn't flinch. She simply watched. Her expression unreadable. Her eyes sharp, patient, waiting, as if she had already calculated exactly how this moment would end and found it interesting. Morgan's mouth opened. No words came. What do you say to a man whose suit costs more than your life? What do you say when you realize, from the dead silence, from the way his security team shifted, from the way the room collectively held its breath, that you haven't just ruined a suit tonight? You've ruined your future. Jamie's hand moved. Slow. Deliberate. His fingers closed around Morgan's wrist like a door being locked from the outside. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It didn't need to be. You're going to want to stay right where you are. Morgan had spent his whole life being invisible in rooms like this. Tonight, he was the only thing anyone could see. And something told him, deep in the part of him that recognized danger the way animals recognize fire, that being seen by Jamie Voss was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is reaching. The Harrington Grand Ballroom was the kind of place that made you feel the weight of everything you didn't have. Morgan felt it the moment he stepped through the service entrance, that particular pressure in the chest that comes from standing inside a world you were never meant to enter. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung from ceilings painted with gold leaf. The floor was white marble, polished so perfectly that the guests above it cast reflections like ghosts of themselves. Waiters moved in choreographed silence. String quartets played in corners. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there was money. Not just in the cufflinks and the gowns and the bottles that cost more than rent. It was in the posture. In the way these people laughed without covering their mouths. In the way they occupied space like the room had been built specifically around them. Morgan pulled his service vest straight and picked up his tray. He had a rule for nights like this. One simple rule that had kept him employed across 7 years of catering, hotel cleaning, and event staffing: keep your eyes down, keep your feet moving, and never, not once, let them remember your face. Invisible. That was the job. Not janitor, not server, not the man collecting empty glasses from tables that cost $500 a seat. The job was to be the hand that appeared and disappeared. The shadow that kept things clean. The presence no one acknowledged because acknowledging him would mean admitting that all of this beauty required invisible labor to sustain it. He was good at it. Tonight he needed to be better than good. His phone had 3 unread messages from his landlord and 1 voicemail from the pharmacy he already knew he couldn't afford to return. His daughter Lily had been running a fever for 4 days. His sister had lent him bus fare twice this week. The $180 he'd earned tonight wasn't enough. It was never enough, but it was something, and something was the only currency Morgan had ever been able to trade in. He moved through the ballroom like water through rock. Lifting. Clearing. Resetting. He'd done this so many times his body operated on a kind of muscle memory that left his mind free to run its calculations. $180 minus bus fare, minus the pharmacy copay, minus the 2 days he'd missed last week when Lily's fever spiked. The numbers never came out right. They hadn't come out right in 3 years, not since the factory closed and the severance ran out and the world quietly rearranged itself into a place that had no clear role for a man with Morgan's particular set of skills. He passed a table of women in jeweled gowns and lifted 2 empty flutes without breaking stride. None of them looked up. Good. That was exactly right. That was the whole point. He had 4 hours left. 4 hours, $180, and then home to Lily. He just needed nothing to go wrong. Morgan was halfway across the ballroom when the energy in the room changed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no announcement, no fanfare, no parting of the crowd like a movie scene. It was subtler than that, and somehow more unsettling for it. The laughter in the eastern corner died down first. Then the conversation near the bar thinned. The string quartet didn't stop playing, but one of the violinists missed a note, and that small imperfection rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Morgan turned, not because he meant to, but because every instinct he had pointed him toward the source of that shift the way a compass finds north whether you want it to or not. Jamie Voss had arrived. He came through the main entrance the way powerful men always do, unhurried, unannounced, and utterly certain of the effect his presence would have. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a cream suit with the kind of sharp tailoring that didn't come from a store. It came from a person whose full-time job was to make sure Jamie Voss looked exactly like what he was. Every line of that suit was a statement. Every button was a decision made by someone paid very well to make it. His face was calm in a way that wasn't peace. It was control. The kind of composed expression that doesn't come from having nothing to worry about. It comes from having decided, long ago, that worry was a luxury he had stripped from his emotional vocabulary. His eyes moved across the room slowly, registering everything, dismissing most of it. 3 paces behind him, 2 men in dark suits kept perfect distance. Not hovering. Not obvious. Just present in the way that certain kinds of protection always is, until suddenly it isn't. And then there was Vivienne. She entered on his arm, and the room didn't just look, it adjusted. Women straightened. Men reached for their glasses. The kind of involuntary recalibration that happens when something genuinely, almost offensively beautiful walks into a space and resets everyone's internal standard without asking permission. Her gown was gold silk that caught every chandelier in the room and gave it back in pieces. It moved when she moved and settled when she stopped with a kind of theatrical elegance that suggested it, too, understood its assignment. Her hair was swept back. Her jewelry was minimal, the kind of minimal that costs more than extravagance. And her posture was so perfect, so practiced, that Morgan found himself wondering, briefly, whether she'd been trained for this the way soldiers are trained for war. But it was her eyes that made him look away first. They weren't warm. They weren't cold either. Cold implied an absence of something. Vivienne's eyes were calculating in the active sense. Sharp. Assessing. Moving across the room the way a chess player scans a board, not looking for what's beautiful, but for what's useful. For what could be moved. For what could be sacrificed. The crowd didn't part for Jamie and Vivienne. It orbited. Like bodies around a gravitational center they hadn't chosen but couldn't resist. Within 4 minutes of their arrival, the most important people in the room had found reasons to drift into their radius, laughing a little louder, gesturing a little wider, performing their wealth for an audience of 2. Morgan turned back to his tray. His rule. Eyes down. Keep moving. He had $180 to earn and no room in tonight's budget for curiosity. It happened because of a chair. That was the thing no one would ever know, and the thing Morgan would replay for the rest of his life with the specific, grinding torture of what if. A guest near the center of the room had pushed back from his table without looking, and the chair leg caught the floor at an angle that sent it sliding exactly 18 inches to the left, directly into Morgan's path. He was moving at a steady pace with a full tray. For glasses. One of them, the one closest to the edge, held the last pour from a bottle of Chateau Margaux that some table had ordered and barely touched. Deep red. Full to the rim. His foot caught the chair leg. The tray didn't fall. He almost saved it. His left hand shot out, palm up, fingers spreading, and for one impossible half-second the tray was still level and the glasses were still upright and the evening was still intact. Then the momentum continued and the tray tilted and gravity, which has never once in the history of the world shown mercy, did what gravity does. The glass left the tray at an angle that seemed, in the stretched and terrible silence of the next 2 seconds, almost deliberate. Almost aimed. As if the universe had done the geometry carefully and decided that the single worst place for that wine to land, out of every surface, every person, every square foot of ballroom floor in that entire room, was Jamie Voss's cream suit. It hit him in the chest. The sound was quiet. Just a soft, wet impact. But in the silence that followed, the silence that detonated across the room like a pressure wave, that small sound was the loudest thing Morgan had ever heard. The wine spread across the cream fabric in a dark, blooming stain. Not a drop. Not a splash. A statement. It soaked through the lapel and across the chest and down toward the pocket square with the unhurried certainty of something that knew it had already won. For a single frame, one fraction of a second, Morgan saw his reflection in the marble floor. Black vest, white shirt, empty tray, and the particular expression of a man watching his life detonate in slow motion. Then Vivienne made a sound. Not a gasp. Not a scream. Something quieter and far more dangerous than either, a sharp, controlled intake of breath that was less about surprise and more about cataloging. Like she was filing this moment away somewhere. Her gold gown had caught a few drops along the hem, and she looked down at them with an expression that was absolutely unreadable, which, Morgan was beginning to understand, was the most frightening expression she had. 300 people turned. The music stopped. Morgan's mouth opened. He had words, "I'm so sorry, it was an accident, please, I'm so sorry," but they lived somewhere behind his sternum and refused to move. His chest was doing something wrong. His hands were shaking. The tray in his grip felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and the room, which had been a ballroom 30 seconds ago, now felt like a courtroom. Jamie Voss looked down at his chest. He didn't make a sound. He didn't reach for the stain or step back or do any of the things a normal person does when something cold and wet hits them unexpectedly. He simply looked. Patient and precise and utterly without panic. The way a man looks at something when he is deciding what it costs. Then he raised his eyes. And they found Morgan. Nobody moved. Not the guests. Not the staff. Not the 2 men in dark suits positioned 6 feet behind their employer. The entire room had become a held breath, and Morgan was standing at the center of it with a tilted tray and the creeping, cellular certainty that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Jamie Voss took one step forward. Just one. He didn't need more than that. Put the tray down. His voice was quiet. Conversational, almost. The kind of voice that doesn't need volume because it has never once in its existence been anything other than obeyed. There was no anger in it, or if there was, it was the kind that had been compressed so far down and refined so completely that it no longer resembled anger at all. It resembled certainty. Morgan set the tray on the nearest table. His hands were shaking. He hoped Jamie didn't notice. He was certain Jamie noticed everything. Look at me. Morgan looked up. Up close, Jamie Voss was even more unsettling than he was at a distance. His face was controlled in a way that felt architectural, like every expression on it had been chosen rather than felt. The dark stain on his chest sat between them like evidence. Like a thing that had already been decided and now simply required processing. What's your name? Morgan. His voice came out smaller than he intended. Morgan Ellis. It was an accident, I tripped on there was a chair, I didn't see it, I'm so. Morgan. Jamie said his name the way you say a period at the end of a sentence. Not unkind. Simply final. Stop talking. Morgan stopped talking. Jamie reached into the breast pocket of his ruined suit, unhurried, 2 fingers, and produced a card. Plain white. No logo Morgan could see. He held it between 2 fingers and looked at it for a moment, then looked at Morgan. That suit is bespoke. He said it the way you state a weather fact. The fabric is Italian. The tailoring took 6 weeks. He paused. It is not replaceable. Morgan's throat tightened. I understand. I'll pay for whatever. You'll pay. It wasn't a question. It was an echo. Jamie repeated it the way you repeat something that almost made you smile. Then his hand moved, and Morgan felt it before he processed it. Fingers around his wrist. Not crushing. Not violent. Just present and absolute, the way a locked door is absolute. Not asking anything. Not threatening anything. Simply establishing that Morgan was no longer going anywhere under his own authority. You'll come to my office tomorrow morning. Jamie pressed the card into Morgan's palm with the same hand that held his wrist, and then released him. Smooth. Practiced. As if this were a transaction he had performed before. 8 o'clock. Don't be late. Don't not show up. A pause. The second option will be worse for you than the first. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Vivienne, who had not spoken a single word through the entire exchange, turned back toward the room and accepted a fresh glass of champagne from a server who materialized from nowhere. She swirled it once, slowly, and her eyes, still sharp, still assessing, drifted to Morgan with an expression he couldn't name. Not pity. Not malice. Something that looked, unsettlingly, like interest. Jamie straightened his ruined jacket. Looked around the room once, a single, sweeping glance that seemed to reset the social temperature of every person it touched, and then turned and resumed his evening as if nothing had happened. As if Morgan Ellis had already been dealt with. As if the outcome of tomorrow was something he already knew. The music started again, cautiously, and the room exhaled. Conversations restarted in hushed, electric tones. Somebody laughed nervously near the bar. The ballroom reassembled itself around the absence of drama the way a body closes around a wound. Morgan stood exactly where Jamie had left him, the card in his palm, his wrist still warm from a grip that was already gone. He turned the card over. One address. One time. 8 a.m. He thought about Lily. About the pharmacy. About the $180 he was almost certain he was no longer going to collect tonight. Then he thought about the second option. He put the card in his pocket. The building had no name on the outside. That was the first thing Morgan noticed when he stepped off the bus on Callaway Street at 7:52 the next morning. Every other tower in this part of the city wore its identity on its face: corporate logos, brass lettering, illuminated signs. This building had nothing. Just clean black glass climbing 40 floors into a grey sky, and a single revolving door attended by two men whose stillness was a language Morgan was beginning to learn to read. He almost turned around 3 times on the walk from the bus stop. He didn't. Because somehow he understood that turning around was not actually an option, not in any real sense. The card in his pocket wasn't an invitation. It was a coordinate. And whatever Jamie Voss was, he was the kind of man who noticed when people failed to arrive at coordinates he had given them. The lobby was cold in a way that felt intentional. White walls, white floors, one security desk staffed by a man who looked at Morgan the way people look at things they are already categorizing as problems. Morgan gave his name. Showed the card. Was directed to an elevator that required a separate keycard to operate, which the man behind the desk provided without explanation or warmth. The elevator opened on the 38th floor. More white. A corridor lined with the kind of silence that costs money to maintain. An assistant at a desk near the end, young, immaculate, efficient in the precise way that suggested she had been selected for the role rather than hired for it, looked up when Morgan stepped out. Mr. Ellis. Not a question. He's ready for you. He's ready for you. As if Morgan had been expected. As if this was simply the next step in a process already in motion. He was shown through a door into an office that rewrote his understanding of what an office could be. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, the city spread out below them like a map of everything Morgan had never had access to. Furniture in dark leather and dark wood. A desk that was less a desk than a statement of dominion. And behind it, already seated, jacket changed, a new cream suit as immaculate as yesterday's had been before Morgan dismantled it, Jamie Voss. He didn't look up immediately. He was reading something. He finished it, set it aside, and then looked at Morgan with the same contained, assessing focus he had used in the ballroom. Sit down. Morgan Saturday. Jamie opened a drawer, produced a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the desk without comment. Morgan picked it up. He read it. He read it again. $20,000. He said it out loud because saying it aloud was the only way to confirm that his eyes were reporting accurately. The suit, Jamie said. The cleaning fee for Vivienne's gown. The disruption cost. He listed them the way someone reads items off a grocery list, matter of fact, complete. $20,340. Rounded down as a courtesy. Morgan set the paper on the desk because his hands had started doing something he didn't want Jamie to see. I don't, he stopped. Started again. I make $11 an hour. I'm aware. I can't, the words weren't coming out in the right order. This isn't, I don't have this. I could work for a year and not. 5 years, Jamie said. At your current rate, accounting for taxes, approximately 5 years and 4 months to clear this figure. He said it without cruelty and without sympathy. He said it the way you say a distance between 2 cities. Here is where you are. Here is where the number is. Here is the space between them. Morgan stared at the paper. $20,000. The number sat on the page the way the wine had sat on the cream suit, spreading, darkening, filling all available space. He thought about Lily's fever. He thought about the landlord's voicemail. He thought about 5 years of doing the math wrong every single night and still coming up short. And then, underneath all of that, something quieter, a specific, cold understanding that the man across this desk had not brought him here to discuss a payment plan. He looked up. Jamie was watching him with the patience of someone who had already decided what came next and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "You have something I don't have access to," Jamie said. His tone shifted, not warmer, but more precise. The way a surgeon's voice shifts when they move from pleasantries to procedure. Invisibility. You move through rooms and no one sees you. You hear things. You're in spaces where my people can't go without being noticed. He paused. "I have use for that." Morgan waited. "Come and work for me. Directly. Not cleaning. Not serving." Jamie folded his hands on the desk. "You'll work off the debt. 60 days. After that, we renegotiate or we part ways. Clean." The office was very quiet. Outside the windows, 40 floors below, the city moved through its morning with complete indifference to the fact that Morgan Ellis was sitting in a chair that probably cost more than his car, being offered an arrangement that wasn't an offer at all, not really. Not when the alternative was $20,000 he would spend the next 5 years failing to produce. "What exactly would I be doing?" Morgan asked. Jamie's expression didn't change. "Watching. Listening. Reporting." A pause. "And above all, being exactly what you already are." He slid a second document across the desk. Morgan looked down at it. "The Invisible Man," Jamie said. "Turns out that's the most valuable thing in a room full of people pretending not to see each other." Morgan picked up the pen. His hand had stopped shaking. He wasn't sure if that was courage or simply the particular stillness that settles in when a decision has already been made for you and your body has accepted it before your mind caught up. He signed. Jamie collected the paper without looking at it. Stood. Adjusted the cuff of his jacket. "My assistant will brief you on the details." He moved toward the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the city with the expression of a man reviewing something he owns. "Welcome to the arrangement, Morgan." Morgan stood. He looked at the door. At the desk. At the paper with his signature still sitting on it. 60 days. He told himself it was just 60 days. He told himself that the way you tell yourself a lot of things that you already know aren't entirely true. The briefing took 40 minutes. The assistant, her name was Claire, delivered without warmth or small talk, walked Morgan through a document that was less an employment contract and more a carefully constructed cage. Non-disclosure. Non-interference. Non-negotiation. He would have no business card, no official title, no email address on any company system. If anyone asked, he was facilities support, a classification so deliberately vague it amounted to institutional invisibility, which Morgan was beginning to understand was precisely the point. His hours were Jamie's hours. Which meant early and late and the unpredictable in between. His access was total and restricted at the same time. He could move through every floor of the building, every event Jamie attended, every room that required presence without scrutiny. But he would communicate only upward. Never sideways. Never out. "You'll carry this." Claire placed a phone on the table. "Matte black, no case, no branding. It receives. It doesn't call out except to one number." She said it the way you explain a tool's single function. No elaboration. Morgan picked it up. It was lighter than he expected. "Any questions?" He had approximately 40. He asked the only one that mattered, "When do I start?" "You already have," she said, and stood to leave. That was how it began. Not with ceremony. Not with a handshake or a welcome or any of the markers that make a beginning feel like a beginning. Just a phone in his hand and a door closing behind someone who had already moved on to the next item on her list. Morgan sat in the briefing room for a moment after she left. He thought about calling his sister to tell her. He thought about what he would say. I spilled wine on a mafia boss and now I work for him. He thought about how that would sound out loud and decided it would sound exactly as insane as it was. He put the phone in his pocket. He went to find out what an invisible man was worth to a man who owned everything. By the end of the first week, Morgan had developed a new understanding of the word controlled. He had thought, before, that he understood what discipline looked like. He had worked for demanding people, managers who timed break lengths, supervisors who counted absences. But Jamie Voss operated at a frequency so far beyond that register that Morgan had to entirely recalibrate his sense of what a human being could optimize. Jamie slept 5 hours. Exactly. Morgan knew this because the black phone received its first message each morning at 5:17 a.m., and the building's overnight logs, which Morgan had quiet access to, by design, showed Jamie's keycard active in his private office until precisely 12:40. He ate at his desk. He exercised in a basement gym between 5:30 and 6:15 with the focus of someone completing a maintenance task rather than a person who might enjoy movement. His schedule was structured to the quarter hour, and deviations from it were treated not with frustration but with the cold, efficient adjustments of someone correcting a variable in a formula. He did not do small talk. He did not do pleasantries. When he spoke, every sentence was load-bearing, it carried something, moved something, established something. Morgan had been in his orbit for 6 days before he heard Jamie say anything that wasn't directional, and even then it was only 4 words, spoken to no one in particular while standing at his office window at the end of a Thursday that had run 3 hours longer than scheduled. Inefficiency is a choice. Not to Morgan. Not to Claire. Just, outward. Into the glass. As if confirming something to himself. Morgan, who had been collecting a coffee tray from the sideboard and had gone so still he barely breathed, filed it away. That was his actual job, he was learning. Not fetching. Not cleaning. Filing. Watching. Building a map of the man's patterns so precise that Morgan could identify, sometimes before Jamie's own staff could, when something was operating outside its expected range. It was strange work. Intimate in a way Morgan hadn't anticipated. You learn the shape of a person when you watch them when they think no one is watching. And what Morgan was learning about Jamie Voss was that beneath the architecture, beneath the controlled expression and the precise voice and the suit that never had a wrinkle by 9 a.m., there were exactly 3 things that produced something that looked, briefly and carefully, like feeling. The first was a photograph on the corner of his desk. Small, framed simply. A woman Morgan didn't recognize, older, laughing at something outside the frame. Jamie never looked at it when others were present. Alone, sometimes, his eyes would settle on it for 3 or 4 seconds before moving on. That was all. But those seconds were different from every other second in his day. The second was music. Late evenings, when the floor emptied and only the building's skeleton crew remained, faint piano would come from behind the closed office door. Not long. Never more than 10 minutes. Always stopped before anyone with a reason to comment might hear it. The third, and this one Morgan took the longest to identify, was Vivienne. Not the public Vivienne. Not the gold gown, sharp eyes, calculated expression Vivienne that the world received. There were moments, rare and brief and almost entirely accidental, when Jamie's hand would find the small of her back as she passed him, not possessive, not performative, just present, and something in his posture would shift a degree. So small that a person not trained to notice nothing else would miss it entirely. Morgan noticed. He didn't know yet what to do with what he noticed. But he kept collecting it. That was the job. You watch long enough and people tell you everything without ever opening their mouth. He was beginning to understand why Jamie had wanted an invisible man. It was a Tuesday in the third week when Morgan heard it. He was on the 22nd floor, 2 floors below Jamie's primary office, running the standard after-hours rounds that had become his cover for the building's quieter intelligence. It was 9:40 p.m. Most of the floor was dark. He had a cleaning cart because old habits were useful props, and a man with a cart is the least interesting person in any hallway. The conference room at the end of the east corridor was supposed to be empty. The light under the door said otherwise. Morgan slowed. Stopped. Positioned the cart at an angle that made his presence near the door entirely explicable, and listened. 2 voices. Neither of them Jamie's. The first he didn't recognize, low, measured, with the careful diction of someone choosing every word the way you choose footing on unstable ground. The second he did recognize, after a moment, Harlan Voss. Jamie's older cousin. Morgan had seen him twice at the building, both times in the lobby, both times with the specific energy of someone performing a relationship they didn't feel. What they were saying stopped Morgan's breath mid-draw. The Meridian contract, the acquisition Jamie had been quietly building toward for months, the one that Claire never discussed directly but that Morgan had assembled from fragments of conversation and half-visible documents, was being handed over. Not delayed. Not disrupted. Handed. To a competitor whose name Morgan didn't catch but whose arrangement with Harlan was apparently old enough and detailed enough to suggest this had never been about the contract at all. It was about the position. If the Meridian deal collapsed publicly, attributed to a failure in Jamie's judgment, the board could move. Harlan would be positioned. And the man whose voice Morgan didn't recognize would get his access to the infrastructure that apparently came with the seat. He heard the word irreversible and then the word gala and then a date, 11 days from now, and then he heard Harlan say, with a flatness that made the hair on Morgan's arms rise, by the time he understands what happened, it'll already be done. The chair scraped back from the table. Morgan moved. Smoothly, purposefully, cart already in motion by the time the door handle turned, around the corner and down the adjacent corridor, pace exactly steady, shoulders exactly right, the posture of someone with nowhere interesting to be. He turned into the main corridor and kept walking. His mind was doing something different from walking. He could say nothing. He could complete his 60 days, clear the debt, leave. Whatever happened to Jamie Voss in the boardroom of his own company was not Morgan Ellis's concern. He had not been hired to protect. He had been hired to observe. But he kept thinking about the photograph on the corner of the desk. The 10 minutes of piano at the end of a long evening. The hand at the small of Vivienne's back. He kept thinking about the fact that 3 weeks ago, Jamie Voss had been the most frightening person in any room Morgan had ever been in. He was still frightening. But Morgan had stopped being afraid of him somewhere around day 9, and he wasn't entirely sure what had replaced the fear. Something more complicated. Something that felt, uncomfortably, like the beginning of loyalty. He reached the elevator. Pressed the button for 38. He took out the matte black phone. 1 number. He pressed it. The Callaway Foundation Gala was held 11 days later, exactly as the voices in the conference room had said. It was smaller than the Harrington event, more exclusive, which in this world meant more dangerous, because the people in the room were fewer but their reach was longer and their patience for disruption was shorter. Black tie. A rooftop venue with the city glittering below it on 3 sides. The kind of event where the conversations that mattered happened in the margins and the food was largely decorative. Morgan was there as facility support. He moved through the evening with his cart and his vest and his particular gift for occupying rooms without registering in them. But tonight the cart was incidental. Tonight he was moving along coordinates that Jamie had given him in a conversation that lasted exactly 7 minutes and contained no excess words. The transfer is supposed to happen at 10:15. East Terrace. Harlan will be there. So will someone you haven't seen before. He'll come from the inside, not the entrance, which means he already has access. I need to know who let him in. Morgan had nodded. You don't intervene, Jamie had said. You watch. You confirm. That's all. He'd paused then, in the way that Morgan had come to recognize as the pause that carries the actual weight of what's being communicated. Don't get seen. As if Morgan needed to be told. He was at the East Terrace at 10:08, positioned at the service alcove adjacent to the exterior bar, a tray of empty glasses in hand and his eyes on the far end of the terrace where a low arrangement of potted trees created just enough shadow to make a conversation feel private. At 10:11, Harlan arrived. He had a drink. He looked relaxed in the careful way of someone who has rehearsed relaxation. At 10:14, the second man came from inside. Morgan clocked him the moment he stepped through the terrace doors, mid-50s, silver-haired, moving with the particular ease of someone accustomed to access. He was wearing a foundation board lanyard. Not a guest badge. A board lanyard. Morgan held very still. He had seen that face before. Not in person. In the fragments he'd assembled over 3 weeks, a name on a document visible for 3 seconds on Claire's desk, a photograph in a framed article on the lobby wall that he'd passed every morning without registering. Chairman of the Acquisition Oversight Committee. The man who would be first to call the vote if the Meridian deal collapsed. They spoke for 4 minutes. Morgan was too far to hear the words, but he didn't need them. He had the confirmation. He had the face. He had the lanyard and the timing and the East Terrace and all of it assembled into a picture so clear it required no caption. He didn't reach for the phone. Jamie was already there. He stepped onto the terrace from the northern entrance at 10:17, and he did not come alone. 2 men flanked him, not the usual security detail, Morgan noted. Different. More deliberate. And behind them, moving quietly and without her gold gown but no less precise in the way she occupied space, was Vivienne. Her eyes found Morgan across the terrace before Jamie's did. She gave him nothing. No nod, no signal. Just that same sharp, assessing look she trained on him the night of the spill, the one that had looked, then, like interest, and looked now like something Morgan was only just beginning to find a name for. Recognition. What happened next was not loud. It was not dramatic in any of the ways the movies had taught Morgan to expect power to assert itself. There was no confrontation. No raised voices. No moment where Harlan crumbled visibly or the silver-haired chairman reached for a phone. Jamie simply walked to the center of that terrace and stood there, and the weight of his presence, the gravity that had reorganized that first ballroom the night of his arrival, did what it always did. Everything stopped orbiting and started accounting for him. He spoke briefly with the chairman. Morgan couldn't hear it. But he watched the chairman's face move through several expressions in rapid succession, composure, calculation, something that looked briefly like fear, before settling into the tight, controlled blankness of a man doing rapid triage on a situation he had misread entirely. Harlan said nothing. He set his drink down on the terrace railing and looked out at the city and did not look at Jamie once. It was over in under 10 minutes. The gala continued. The string quartet on the interior floor played something slow and elegant. Guests refilled their glasses and performed their wealth for each other as they always had. Morgan stood in his service alcove with his tray of empty glasses and felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, that he could breathe all the way to the bottom of his lungs. 3 days later, Morgan was called to the 38th floor at 7 a.m. Not by the phone. By Claire, in person, at his locker on the maintenance level, which meant it had been planned rather than immediate, and planned meant Jamie had decided something. The office looked the same. The city behind the windows. The dark furniture. The photograph in its simple frame at the corner of the desk. Jamie was standing, not seated, which Morgan had learned to read as a shift in the nature of a conversation. "The Meridian deal closed this morning," Jamie said. No preamble. 6 weeks ahead of schedule. He didn't elaborate on what that meant or how. Morgan understood enough by now to fill in the architecture himself. The chairman had been quietly removed from the oversight committee. Harlan had submitted a leave of absence. Both had been handled with the same clean precision that characterized everything Jamie did, not loudly, not publicly. Simply resolved, the way you resolve a variable that was never supposed to be in the equation. "The 60 days end Thursday," Jamie continued. Morgan nodded. "The debt is cleared." Another nod. Jamie moved to the window. Hands behind his back. The city arranged below him in its familiar, indifferent geometry. "I'm offering you a permanent role." He said it to the glass, not to Morgan, which Morgan had learned was not dismissiveness but the particular way Jamie said things that mattered to him. "Head of Internal Intelligence. You'll have a team, small, 2 people. Your own floor access. A salary that is not $11 an hour." A pause. "Benefits. For dependents." The last 2 words landed differently from the others. Morgan was quiet for a moment. "You knew about Lily," he said. Not an accusation. Just the completion of a picture he should have finished earlier. "I know everything about the people in my building," Jamie said, still to the window. "That's always been true." Another pause. "It's also why I know you didn't have to make that call from the elevator. You could have stayed invisible. Completed the 60 days and walked away without consequence." He turned then. For the first time in this conversation, he looked directly at Morgan. "Why didn't you?" Morgan considered lying. He considered a strategic answer, something that sounded like professional calculation rather than the messier truth. But he was tired of performing invisibility in rooms where he was clearly, finally, being seen. "Because you trusted me with information," Morgan said. "And I know what it costs when someone does that and you treat it like it meant nothing." Jamie looked at him for a long moment. His expression didn't change, not dramatically. But something in it shifted. The architectural control relaxed a single degree, in the way that Morgan had learned to read as the closest Jamie Voss came to telling you that something you said had landed somewhere real. He turned back to the window. "Thursday," he said. "Give me your answer by Thursday." Morgan picked up his cart from where he'd left it outside the door. He walked to the elevator. Pressed the button for the ground floor. He thought about $11 an hour and a pharmacy copay he'd been doing math around for 3 years. He thought about Lily's fever breaking on day 5 of his second week, the morning after the first paycheck from this arrangement had cleared, larger than any single paycheck he'd received in his adult life. He thought about the way he moved through rooms now, still quiet, still watchful, but different. Not invisible because he'd been told to be. Invisible because he had chosen to be, which turned out to be an entirely different thing. The elevator opened on the lobby. He walked past the framed article on the wall. Past the photograph of a building that wore no name on its outside because it didn't need one. Past the security desk and the revolving door and out into the morning air of Callaway Street. He had 3 days to give an answer to a question he had already decided. He knew it. He suspected Jamie knew it too. That was the thing about working for a man who missed nothing. Eventually, you stopped being surprised by how much he'd already accounted for. Including, apparently, the particular trajectory of a janitor who spilled wine at the worst possible moment and turned out to be exactly the right person for it. Morgan Ellis had walked into the Harrington Gala 3 weeks ago as a man trying to be invisible. He walked out of this building on a Thursday morning as something else entirely. He still wasn't sure what to call it yet. But for the first time in 3 years, the math was coming out right. And that's where we leave Morgan, not at the end of a story, but at the beginning of one he actually chose. If you made it this far, you already know what kind of person you are. The kind who stays until the last page, and those are exactly the people I make these stories for. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the 60 days are over, but Morgan's story is just getting started. Hit the notification bell so you're the first to know when the next chapter drops. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I genuinely want to say hello to every single one of you and see just how far this story has traveled. See you in the next one.